Given the track record that Marvel's been on the last few years, it's safe to assume that none of us were expecting to ever get back to the glory days of those pre-Disney acquisition films.
On the target.
Watch the road.
I got it.
Guardians of the Galaxy was a film that turned a few heads when the first of the trilogy released back in 2014, and a lot of us were like, huh? Regardless of that, though, this fun blend of sci-fi, action, and comedy was a hit with pretty much every audience. Especially us ladies that appreciate Mr. Pratt's acting. The film opens with a musical sequence we're all used to by now when Gunn is at the helm, with the Guardians having settled with a colony in nowhere. Following the events of Infinity War and Endgame, Quill is still distraught by the loss of Gamora, and has pretty much become a sloppy, whiny drunk. We'll come back to this. In comes Adam Warlock, just blasting his way through this settlement, wrecking the Guardians left and right and turning their peaceful colony into a war zone. Turns out Adam has been sent by his mother, Aisha, Empress of the Sovereign, to retrieve Rocket for the High Evolutionary. Unfortunately, Adam is a bumbling idiot that was basically born yesterday and therefore doesn't comprehend his own strength. Nebula finally weakens him with a stabby stab to the gut, and the Guardians rush to a medbay to find Rocket barely hanging on to life. In an attempt to revive him, they find out he has a kill switch linked to his heart that will kill him if anyone tries to operate on him. The Guardians gear up and head out to this place in an effort to find a cure for their friend, encountering some familiar and fun faces along the way. Guardians of the Galaxy gets some stuff right, but gets a lot of it wrong. That being said, this is definitely one of the stronger entries in the last two Marvel phases, but that's also like saying here's a shiny turd in a pile of baby diarrhea. The biggest theme of the previous two entries was the importance of family and friendship, as each of the Guardians had experienced some sort of tragedy or trauma relating to either of these. Peter, the loss of his mother, then psychopathic father; Nebula and Gamora, their tumultuous relationship with Thanos; Drax, the loss of his wife and child to Thanos; Mantis, the lack of experience of non-manipulative familial relationships; and Groot, who just seems to be a wanderer.
I am Groot.
Guardians of the Galaxy 3 continues this theme of family and friend relationships, with the main reasoning behind the team looking to save Rocket being that he's a dear friend. And the movie makes that abundantly obvious by stating it about a half dozen times, as opposed to actually showing it as the previous entries had done. Also, remember how Gamora died in Infinity War and we saw an alternate version of her in Endgame? Well, she's back as well, and the plot basically uses her as a narrative foil to the friendship the rest of the Guardians have with Rocket. The plot doesn't shy away from reminding you of these two opposites, and as a result, this ends up being a supporting arc for about half of the story throughout the movie. And let me tell you, it gets old really fast. Star-Lord has always been known as a silly character, but one that still is able to push forward through the goofiness when the plot requires him to. While he still does it here, it feels like they wholly nuked him and made him into a bit of a pussy because Gamora. For a great majority of the film, instead of being the leader, he's a bumbling wuss who can't seem to push past his love for old Gamora to save his friend in basically 90% of the scenes they're in together. Only in the final act of the film do we finally get the Peter Quill we've seen before, a boyishly handsome quirk with good aim and an even better flair for the dramatic. Speaking of nuking characters, they do the same with Mantis, making her the butt of too many jokes, until again, the final act where her strengths are used as a plot device and as less of an appreciation for what she represents, the inner part of us that to some degree seeks conformity. In fact, even Drax, who's consistently been the comedic relief throughout the previous two Guardians films, is treated the same way, like an idiot until the plot demands him to be otherwise. This entry, if anything, ends up serving as an example of how comedy has killed the MCU by choosing cheap laughs over critical depth. Gamora is absolutely cutthroat, which Nebula outwardly states is how she was during her time with Thanos. With her acting as the narrative foil, her character does a bunch of flips that are all too easy to miss and still pretty confusing after leaving the theater. Her character doesn't shy away from the fact that she doesn't give a flying fart about the Guardians or Rocket, but suddenly does a complete 180 no-scope once she's under attack while protecting a comatose Rocket, despite just scenes earlier being ready to dip out and leave him to die or get kidnapped. Her character arc would have been more appropriate had Gunn just taken the time to flesh her out more. Nebula more or less stays pretty true to her character arc, thankfully, but visually, for fuck's sakes, I didn't think it was possible to make Karen Gillian fugly. I swear I was looking at Yondu with a Shop Nebula face every time time she was on screen. Rocket Raccoon is really the main character of this film, and his storyline makes up the other half of Guardians of the Galaxy 3 and also makes up for the mediocrity of the plot. I think it's fair to say that a lot of us have gotten used to Marvel and Disney rushing character backgrounds for the sake of getting content or the message out there. So it was quite refreshing that despite all the long-winded slow-mo shots and musical interludes, that we got a full backstory for Rocket that didn't disappoint. Turns out the High Evolutionary is a mad scientist trying to create a perfect society, and Rocket happened to be one of the animal experiments from way back when. We see a cute little baby Rocket and his origins alongside some fellow experiments, Lila, Teeths, and Floor. Here's where the themes of family and friendship wind in perfectly, by seeing a softer Rocket that cared more openly for others and saw the silver lining in the absolute worst of situations. I genuinely felt for his character as he grew friends, dreamt of a life outside the cage, and then subsequently broke down upon witnessing the unjust murder of the only family he ever knew. It's an angle that's been approached in some form before, but here it was executed well enough that I found myself tearing up in the theater on several occasions. Those flashback sequences of Rocket's past were the only parts of the movie that made me feel as though I was watching a pre-Disney acquisition Marvel film. It was a glimpse at the character development we once had and could have had here. And I felt this with almost every character over the course of the 2.5 hours I was in the theater. In my opinion, this is what made the send-off for the Guardians so mid. Amidst telling a fairly well-fleshed backstory was a mediocre plot that didn't offer fresh takes, and a mix of characters that weren't given the full time of day. Oh, remember how I mentioned Adam Warlock attacking Rocket earlier? Also remember how that dude's been teased like 3 times in the last decade? Yeah, Adam is reduced down to essentially a plot convenience in this film and another bumbling idiot, which given Marvel's whole emasculation trend seems about right. I think the only male they actually give strength to is the High Evolutionary, and to be honest, he was a genuinely good villain. My only criticism of him is that I wish we could have seen more, as his vision for a perfect utopia, created off the backs of horrifying experimentation, is a premise worth exploring in a cinematic universe that has watered down too many good villains. Speaking of, we learned in the final arc that the High Evolutionary has begun experimenting on children for his utopia. Again, a devilishly evil plotline that would have been fantastic to explore instead of witnessing an on-screen manifestation of your furry fetish, James Gunn. Overall, Guardians of the Galaxy 3 feels like a mess, not because it's pushing a message or forcing things on you, but because it fails to do justice to a lot of characters we've come to love or anticipated, while simultaneously giving us one of the more moving backstories that we've seen since the end of Phase 3. It's a mixed bag of themes and character arcs that fail to find a sweet spot. Writer and director James Gunn seems almost afraid to provide his script with any meaningful depth, and as a result, much of the movie falls flatter than the forced dance sequence at the end. Regardless, this sayonara to Guardians is bittersweet as we bid farewell to the last remaining pieces of peak Marvel. Anyways, that's all I have for today. Thanks for stopping by and stay frosty, friends.